As coaches, we know the frustration of feeling uncertain on how to progress training weeks for lifters. Should you make a linear progressions? Should you keep the dose easy earlier on, or should you ramp up the dose relatively quickly? When you do progress a week, do you know whether to progress with volume or intensity or both? But what if I told you that there are some clear principles and processes to design progressions through programs that lead to consistent momentum of progress? Now, in this video, I'm going to break down all of the principles and processes that I use for week-to-week progressions and options for strategies to help you fine-tune your training weeks so that your lifters can keep making progress and hit PRs to smash their goals. Now, first things first, that we need to define some terms that we are going to keep using. Now, some of these words do get used interchangeably, but conceptually speaking, they're very different things. Progress and progression are two terms that people use interchangeably within the world of powerlifting. And for the purpose of what we're going to discuss today, we need to clarify that when we say progress, we are specifically referring to the progress in performance, i.e. increase in performance. Now, when we refer to progression, on the other hand, we are specifically referring to progression in the stimulus, i.e. increase in the training dose. So what about overload and progressive overload? Now, if a stimulus has enough overload, that means that it is large enough to cause positive adaptations towards the qualities that we need. And progressive overload, for all intensive purposes, is merely the observation that over time, the dose of the stimulus that the athlete needs will tend to get bigger. But a very important point to remember is that progressions may lead to progress, but we do not necessarily need to always have weekly progressions in a stimulus to get progress through the block. For the vast majority of the year, the thing that we care about is ensuring that the training week is a training dose that provides sufficient enough overloading stimulus that causes positive adaptations, i.e. gains in progress. So let's actually define what we mean by the training dose. Well, the training dose refers to the nature of the training prescription that we give to a lifter. It's going to be the combination of the volumes and intensities of the specific movements that the lifter does. And for every dose that we impose, there is going to be a subsequent response to that. And that is the dose-response relationship. Since volume and intensities are two different dimensions of the training dose, we can probably visualize the dose-response relationship in a 3D bell curve here. But for simplicity, we can just use a 2D version to understand the dose response. So when it comes to figuring out the weekly progressions in a block, there are some principles that we should follow and some processes we should implement and progression strategies that we can consider. So let's talk about the principles for weekly progressions. Now, when it comes to principles, we are not referring too much about the training principles of overload, specificity, etc. We are referring more to some rules of thumb specifically for weekly progressions. When it comes to designing microcycles in a mesocycle or training weeks in a training block, we want to optimize the amount of time that we spend training to be exposed to a dose that is positively adaptive. Now, what I mean by that is that the training dose should be anywhere between the minimum effective dose and a maximal recoverable dose. Now, the minimum effective dose is the smallest amount of training that we can do to create some positive gains. The maximal recoverable dose is the most amount of training that we can do where we can just about cover back to baseline at a certain point in time. So everywhere in between, by definition, will cause us to create upward progress and therefore momentum through the block. Another thing worth considering is avoiding training spikes. Now, context obviously matters here, particularly when it comes to earlier weeks in the block, but generally speaking, the reasons why you want to avoid massive jumps from week to week are spikes in training load can be a risk factor for injury. There's also a risk of overshooting, since there is always uncertainty with where your top end performance is. By making massive jumps in training dose, you risk potentially choosing weights that are way too high. And this is obviously going to have consequences with fatigue. Which brings me on to the next one, which is fatigue management. What you need to consider is the uncertainty with the recoverability of such increases in training dose. This can be the reason why, for some people, it's wiser to jump a little bit more conservatively, and if you suddenly have spikes in training dose to the point that it is beyond what you can recover from, then you give yourself crashes in performance afterwards, which can destroy the momentum by creating too much volatility in performance. The next principle is using informed decisions backed by training history. Whenever we have good, clear data of what has been done and the response to that training, whether they were successful or not, they give us clues to how the lifter responds to certain doses of training. This includes looking at volume, intensity, frequency, and how the sessions were spread out through the week. When taking externals into consideration, you can therefore infer where the doses of training from previous exposures may lie on a dose-response curve. Caveat here is that past training that was positively stimulating doesn't always guarantee future progress. This is simply because over time, the athlete will respond and adapt to new levels of training and actually become a different lifter themselves.
Things are gonna be different now.
And let's explore some of the processes to inform how we can design weekly progressions. So the first one is obviously researching training history. Key things to look out for are periods where the lifter has had the greatest upward trends in progress, greatest drops in progress, and looking at training doses that was done around those times. And from that, you can start profiling the dose of those microcycles. After looking at volume and intensity of those key spots in training, you can infer where someone's optimal dose or maximal adaptive dose may be, or at least what someone can actually at least recover from. You can profile the dose of training weeks by looking at the response and performance in the subsequent weeks. And this will give you a rough idea of what may potentially happen if you give someone a certain training week. If you can profile the training weeks or microcycles, you can figure out how you may start someone's training block and how you may progress them through that block. So let's explore some of these strategies and options for weekly progressions and why you may want to choose them. So the first one is going to be the static microcycle or the no progression approach. This is simply when you decide to give someone a fixed microcycle prescription that is repeated through the whole training period, or the mesocycle. Now, the first obvious use case would be the beginner powerlifter, who's going to benefit from that linear progress that they would get in performance. If not every session, then at least every. Outside of beginners, there are plenty of experienced powerlifters who have adopted this static microcycle approach and no progression approach to weekly progressions. Now, there's been a large influence from reactive training systems and their approaches to bottom-up approach to programming with emerging strategies. If you get the initial microcycle right, you can get really good progress from this. With more experienced lifters, you may have to wait for quite a few more weekly exposures before progress is seen.
I did my weighting! 12 years of it!
So patience is going to be important for this. The downside to this approach is that it can be a very monotonous approach, and I do think that enjoying the process is a big part of adherence. The next strategy for weekly progressions in a mesocycle is the exponential progression. This looks like a slow and steady increase from the beginning, and it ramps up a little bit more aggressively towards the end. Now, this is a useful strategy if you are testing out a new microcycle and you want to hold on to the dose of that first training week and repeat it just to see how the athlete gets on with it initially. Then you may want to consider ramping up if the training dose is either easy enough that it's maintaining performance or it's very adaptable where the progress is increasing. You may also want to do this if the previous block of training was particularly fatiguing and you want to let off some of the accumulated fatigue from the medium term. You may also want to consider this strategy if you know what you want to expose a lifter to in terms of intensity, but you know that the lifter often finds this level of intensity very fatiguing. So you let the lifter get exposed to that intensity towards the end of a block. The next strategy to weekly progressions through a training block is the uniform progression. Now, this looks like a very even increase in stimulus by the same amount every week. So the ramp up in stimulus looks linearly across a block. A good example would be if week 1 you started off at 1 set of 5 at RP5, the next week would be RP6, the third week would be RP7, and so on and so forth. You could choose this linear or uniform progression from week to week as a step up after using an exponential approach, whereby the initial weeks were non-stimulating. So consequently, you want to ramp up the intensity a little bit earlier on in the training block. You could also use this approach if you are writing a new block and you want to expose a lifter to a large spectrum of training doses to see how the lifter responds week after week. The next option for weekly progressions across a block is the logarithmic progression. Now, this is a sort of opposite to the exponential progression, where the initial aggressive ramp up in the training dose happens much closer to the start of a training block. And afterwards, it starts to flatten out to quite a steady training dose where the final few weeks of the training block are similar in difficulty. So you may decide to use this approach if you have a good idea of a dose profile of a microcycle that the athlete can make good week-to-week progress from. However, you know that the initial week needs to be a little bit easier because it's an introduction week or deload week from the previous block. Obviously, these are not the only type of progressions that you can make. Depending on what you want to achieve, there are numerous ways to manipulate the training doses across a training block. And the shape of what you do with that training dose can exist in all kinds of shapes and sizes, such as a bell curve and an S shapes. So let's discuss the actual training variables that we may increase when we do increase. Now, volume is one of those variables that I think most people writing programs should be a little bit careful of. When you do make volume changes, are you making it in total sets, total reps, or rep ranges? For example, if you have 3 sets of 4 in the first week, if you just add 1 set to that to 4 sets of 4, that is technically an increase in work done by about 33%. Now, if you increase by 1 rep range to 3 sets of 5, that is an increase in work done by 25%. If you increase the session by 1 total rep, that is an increase in work done by about 8%. So what you need to take away from this is how you increase the volume matters. And from my experience, we don't aggressively adapt to volumes as much as we think we actually do. When it comes to what you increase on paper, how it appears may seem small and trivial, but if you take a step back, there may be a completely different story if you look at actually how much work was done. Now, do I think that there's a place to increase volume? Absolutely. Where do I think it's an appropriate place to manipulate volume? Typically, if I were to start a block with an easier dose of training, I may deliberately start with lower volume so that I can add the volume progressions afterwards in the subsequent week. One of the things that I think people need to realize is that there is no upper limit to volume that you can increase things to. Unlike intensity, where RP10 and 100% of your 1 rep max is technically the maximum that you can increase things to. So it's really easy to add junk volume and create excessive fatigue. And you can often tell where there is junk volume when the load performance or estimated 1 rep max is either staying flat or trending downwards. And this is by definition beyond your maximal recoverable dose. So let's talk about intensity progression. Now, intensity is likely going to be something that I will manipulate most within a training block or mesocycle. It's easier to manage the overall training stress delicately when manipulating intensity. So you want to consider where you are increasing intensity, because you cannot just blindly increase intensity across the whole training week. Not to say that you can't do that, but consider which sessions you are increasing intensity in. So it's entirely okay to potentially increase intensity in one session but keep the other static. You don't necessarily have to increase intensity across all of the sessions. You could consider increasing the peak intensity, which will bring up the average intensity. Now, you may want to do this in an off-season developmental block. You could consider increasing peak intensity but bringing down the working set intensity to keep the average intensity relatively similar. Now, this may be something that you would want to do in a peak and taper block, where you want to stabilize the dose a little bit more. Ultimately, it depends on what you want to achieve. These are just some examples. There are no hard and fast rules when it comes to manipulating volume and intensity. So long as you are combining that with monitoring training progress and it's creating the outcome that you want, then you're going to be doing a good job. Now, if you found this video useful, please click like, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.